Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is our brand spanking newest member, Sam Flowers. Sam, how are you today?
I'm great to be here, Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm even better because you're here. So thanks for being with
Oh,
us. It's really been exciting to watch your development over the last several months as you've been doing guest posts for us and seeing your writing. You're the exact kind of emerging voice we exist to serve, and it's neat to showcase your work on our blog and now today on our podcast. So thanks for being with us. So, for folks who don't know the story of Sam Flowers, you're sitting in your office right now. Tell us where you're at in the semester, and what do you have coming up here over the next couple of months now that summer break is coming?
yeah. So I'm a assistant professor at a small private school called Lewisburg College. It's a junior college, and so my classes that I teach are more survey classes. I teach, American history up to the Civil War and from Reconstruction to the present. I'm also teaching on the class course. It's called World Civilization 2, which is more or less the back half of European history from Napoleon to the end of the Cold War. And so I've kind of juggled, a lot of different kinds of history, especially when the class schedule is 10 o'clock. I'm teaching about colonization, and then next hour is Reconstruction. I got to jump a few hundred years in mindset. So this is my office. I've got a bunch of, paraphernalia in the back, and one of my bookshelves that I'm slowly trying to fill up with as much as I can obtain at this point.
And some Wolverine claws by the looks of it too over there.
Yes, it's a Lego, actually, Lego
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Wolverine claw. I'm slowly getting back into Lego. One of my birthday presents back in March, which was actually a Lego Capitol Hill building. So I need to
Oh.
I need to get back on that.
Wow, wow. I'm gonna avoid any jokes of little Lego guys storming the Capitol. One thing that's going to be cool, we'll take a snapshot here, and you say a bookshelf you're slowly trying to fill. So when you come back to the podcast in 20 years, your whole back wall will just be full of books. We'll watch your library grow over time, which will be exciting to do.
Yeah, we'll definitely remove the chalkboard that I have back here, and it'll just be a 8x4 whole bookshelf surrounding, and then I'll have to figure out what to do with all my paintings and pictures.
I'm in the same spot. I got a great collection of Civil War art and no place to hang it because my bookshelves cover my walls everywhere. So, since we're talking books, anything particular you're reading these days that's of interest?
So I've been trying to push my understanding of the Civil War into more 1900 or 1950s, 1960s understandings. I talk a lot with my students about the civil rights movement and American history too, and I kind of put this discussion to them as to, is the civil rights movement, the second Reconstruction? Because when we teach at the beginning of the semester, there's a lot of similarities about African Americans being involved in state, local, and federal government positions, and the fight for equality with the 14th and 15th Amendment. And I, kind of show them the written Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and I just kind of tell them, like, this is mere copy and paste of the 14th and 15th Amendment, and kind of get them to understand that the struggle during the Civil Rights Amendment is more of an extension of Reconstruction than this whole new, brand new idea.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the 14th Amendment in the news a lot recently. I was able to touch on it a lot in my classes this semester with birthright citizenship, Insurrection Act, and just, ways that maybe we don't understand that Reconstruction continues to
Mm-hmm.
ripple into our current lives.
Yeah, one of the best books that I actually finished about a month or two ago, John Meacham's Soul of America. I think he really touches on that, kind of starting at the end of the Civil War, moving through Reconstruction and what happens in the Jim Crow South with ideas such as the Lost Cause and the new rise of white democratic politics in the South, and how that kind of, continues into even the 1930s, 1940s. And I always emphasize with my students about that. When you think of the civil rights movement in the 60s, it doesn't just start with MLK's I Have a Dream speech. It goes all the way back to even before the start of the Second World War.
So now in your survey classes, and this is going back to something you said a few minutes ago. In your survey classes, do you find that students are interested in the stories that you're telling? Because, one of the stereotypes we hear today is that, young people particularly, they're just not interested in history. And you've got a pretty good cross section of students and time periods. What's your assessment?
It really depends on the particular time period. Students won't really resonate a lot with the early beginnings of uh, the 13 colonies and the American Revolution, although we'll sometimes try to tie the texts from the Constitution to, what's been happening in maybe the past 10, 20 years. But depending on the subject, it kind of comes in waves. I had a lot of my students get really interested in the war in Vietnam because a lot of their, grandparents or relatives had served in Vietnam, and, having them have this opportunity to share their uh, relative stories and what their experiences were. I also try to use a lot of pop culture when it comes to connecting history to what they know, because a lot of what they know is, when I was growing up, most of the stuff that I initially knew about the Civil War was from Gettysburg or Gods and Generals or Glory or Lincoln. And I try to connect that a little bit with students as well, since we're on the idea of the civil rights movement. Every now and then I try to have them, find similarities and differences between Dr. King and Malcolm X, and then Professor X and Magneto, because
Yeah.
a lot of that is mirror images, and comic books are a great way to interpret for younger kids, the history that they might not fully understand.
That is a great analogy.
It's really like on spot, especially the new Disney Plus X-Men 97 that come out,
Yeah.
and Magneto goes into these long lectures about how mutants are ostracized, and it really harkens to that idea of when Stan Lee and the rest of the Marvel writers from X-Men were creating this, they were creating it during the civil rights movement, and used the idea of mutants as a way of um, portraying that separate but equal Jim Crow status in the South.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it was great stuff too. I love those old classic X-Men. So, um, you're relatively new to teaching, and so this year, what did you learn about history aside from subject matter stuff? But like, what did you learn about sort of the art of history over the course of your year?
I've learned a lot when it comes to being a educator. I've realized that not everything is giving a lecture, and not everything is letting the students do discussion. A lot of it is class management and making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page as to how far along on the timeline we're going. In terms of me, there are certain pieces of history that I'm not, the best at, memorizing. And so the bookshelves are, phenomenal when it comes to brushing up on things that I might not know the most about, especially with the early 1700s in leading up to the American Revolution, or in the 1890s, 1900s with the rise of industrialization, and, men like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Like, a lot of that stuff is not really initially ingrained in my head growing up as someone who loves history. And so kind of going back, refreshing, coming at it with a new perspective on how to tackle it for students who also might not know how to best understand it. And so, in some ways we're all learning together. I'm learning since I'm building my career as an educator. They are also learning with me some interesting tidbits. There might be extra things and little side facts that I'll put on the lectures to be like, hey, I learned this too, so I thought this would be really cool to share with you guys as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the huge challenges of teaching a survey class. Like, I know an awful lot about the Civil War. I know an awful lot about the Overland Campaign. Like, I know deep, but like when you're in a survey class, you've got to know broad because you cover such vast swaths of history, American history and European history. Or I know people who teach Asian history, and like that's a lot to have to suddenly know.
And it's a lot of ground to cover, and as someone who teaches it every day, there's always that worry of, am I missing something that they need to know? Is there something that I'm leaving out for the sake of time management and pushing us through the timeline to the end of the semester. So always going back and trying to, figure out what's important, what's something that maybe I can put in an online assignment, and trying to balance that out.
You touched on something too that I think is really important and admirable, where you say like the bookshelf is your friend, and you're going back and you're referring stuff. And it takes a certain degree of humility to be able to recognize like it's okay for me to not know something and have to go look it up because there are some
Oh
people
yeah.
who refuse to do that, right?
Oh, 100%. Like I know a decent amount about the Civil War and Reconstruction, but it was only 3 or 4 years ago that I was in grad school, and I knew most of military history. And then in my thesis, I had to really dive into things like common soldier letters and memory and things that were more from the bottom up perspective. And I'm new enough and in a way, knowledgeable of myself to know that I'm not going to know everything about, even some of the stuff that I'm an expert on. There's always going to be times to go into books and things that, I might not even think of. Like I'm really good at the Overland Campaign, but when something comes up about Second Bull Run, I might need to go back and read more about that because I might not have all my details correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about the Overland Campaign in a second because we got some
Mm-hmm.
common ground that we can cover on that one. You mentioned grad school a second ago. You studied with my dear friend Angie Zombeck, a great friend of emerging Civil War. Um, how did she help shape your trajectory as you're sort of figuring out your path?
I think because, she studies a different type of Civil War history than what I kind of came into with. I knew what the battles were, strategy, the military tactics, the big overall campaign. But for someone like her who delves into prisoner of war experiences, that common soldier of letters and diaries and memoirs, that really opened my eyes into like a whole new world of seeing the Civil War, not just from battle lines, but from people and people involved in it, people who have opinions as to why they're fighting. She really, pushed us in independent study with books about how common soldier letters are interpreted through over the years, reading James McPherson, Chandra Manning, the late, great Pete Carmichael's book as well. These types of books that she kind of threw at me and said, like, you need to read this to have a better understanding of it. That really kind of opened my eyes to, a broader world. And in so doing so, I now have this newfound love for Civil War memory as well.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by Civil War memory and how that sort of evolves over time and the agendas that get pushed. And it's to me just fascinating terrain to see why and how we remember what we remember. Well, let's back up. Speaking of memory, I'm really curious as to how you got interested in the Civil War in the first place.
Hmm.
What's your Civil War origin story? Were you born just with the X gene, like Professor X's proteges?
In a way, probably. So I got hooked as a really young kid. I got hooked on Indiana Jones, and that was like my history bug.
Yeah.
And
What
one of
what a
the
great
other
hook. What a great hook.
Yeah, and one of the other big hooks for history was honestly a series of books called Magic Treehouse, which essentially is these two kids. They open up a history book or a fiction book, and the treehouse transports them into that particular place and time. And a lot of times, they went to the Civil War, the American Revolution, or Egypt, the Middle Ages, and that really opened my eyes into history in general. I think I got into American history hard in third or fourth grade when I started doing projects on presidential biographies, men like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Lincoln. I think my favorite when I was growing up was Teddy Roosevelt, just because of the name.
Oh, bully,
And
bully. I've got to
yeah,
just give a shout out to my John Adams here on my desk. It's my favorite president. Sorry to interrupt you there, but
no, you're good.
I get super enthusiastic about John Adams.
I think he's very underrated. He was given the tools that he had at the time, and did what he could.
Mm.
What really got me on the Civil War bug was probably my first trip, like most historians nowadays, like my first trip to a battlefield. I'm born and raised in Wilmington, so Fort Fisher was always right down the road. Like we always went for school trips and any kind of summer school kind of day. But what really hooked me was when I went to Gettysburg when I was probably 12 or 13 years old. I went a second time during the sesquicentennial, and it blew my mind. The space, in a way, the ambiance of in some places. Obviously, foot traffic and buses go so many places, but when you sit on Colts Hill or Little Round Top and you just kind of look out into these open fields or into this quiet woods area, it makes you feel something, not necessarily a excitement, but also awe of
Yeah.
what had happened there, and also makes you think about why we have these places kind of well preserved as we do today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not a stretch to call them sacred spaces, as you go and you get in touch with where you're at and what had happened there and what your place is, and to be able to have a moment like that, I think really is an important way to connect with history and with the battlefield itself.
Mhm.
So when you talk about going to Wilmington for field trips, and I grew up in Hershey, Pennsylvania, so we went to Gettysburg for our field trips, same sort of thing. And you go there enough times, and it's like, ooh, wow, cool. But it's like the place you go on field trips, So in some ways, it sort of lost its sense of wonder for me over the years because it was like, yeah, that's where we always kind of go for field trips. Um, so I'm always excited when I hear someone else like, oh, I really connected when I was there. So how did you parlay that sort of connection then into like, I'm going to go study this in school?
It was really something that I just really wanted to do. My mom was a kindergarten, elementary school music teacher. My aunt was also a teacher. I came into a family of people who kind of did public service as careers, and so it seemed very normal for me to want to pursue some form of education role. And I really, going into my bachelor's, I always thought that I would be working, at a historic site or a museum. But I think I got the education bug when I got into grad school, seeing Angie Zombeck, kind of do her thing in her classroom, watching all my other mentors in grad school teach history and, tell it not only through discussions and roundtable like topics, but also telling it as like a story and putting you into the moment, telling about stories such as, John Brown's raid or finding a particular soldier that someone's researching and kind of put them in the spot of places like Antietam or Chancellorsville. It really, gives you that sense of this happened, and the feelings and emotions that come from that, I think, was what really got me into wanting to become an educator.
Yeah, I mean, suddenly it becomes very personal instead of, X's and O's on the map and arrows and stuff. If you can put a soldier in a spot with his letters, and it's like, to me, just a really profound privilege to be able to do that kind of thing. So, now being a good resident of the Tar Heel State, you have a favorite Tar Heel regiment, the 3rd North Carolina. So,
Yes.
what got you connected with the 3rd?
So I never connected the dots until probably last year,
Okay.
but Pete Carmichael's biggest story that he would always tell when it came to lectures and his research was the Futch brothers, John and Charlie Futch, and their experiences at Gettysburg that ultimately led to Charlie getting killed at Colts Hill, and then John a few weeks later deserting the regiment and being found and executed for desertion. And what connected to me was when I started doing research on the 3rd North Carolina, the officer corps in that regiment not only all come from Wilmington, North Carolina, but it's almost in a way intermarried, almost like Game of Thrones. The first colonel for the 3rd North Carolina was Gaston Mars, and his second in command was his brother-in-law, William de Rosset. And it kind of goes down the line of the captains and the majors. They're all related to each other through marriage or through blood. And it makes it so much more personal once the war starts.
Right.
Gaston Mars gets killed in the 7 days, and then William de Rosset essentially is disabled during the fighting at the cornfield in Antietam. And these officers are constantly picked off during these harsh battles at, places like Gettysburg. And then eventually the regiment kind of collapses because they're in the middle of the mule shoe at Spotsylvania, and they're a part of Stewart's brigade that essentially just kind of ceases to exist more or less after. Then the third kind of gets combined with the first infantry for the rest of the war. They fight in the Shenandoah with Jubal Early. They come back into Petersburg by January, February of 65. And by then it's over for most of them. The final commander of the regiment, William Parsley, is killed at Sailor's Creek, with 2 days before Appomattox, and he's been there since the start. He was there for from 7 days to Sailor's Creek. That dude was in the thick of it at Colts Hill, at Antietam. He was and getting wounded left and right on top of that too. And what makes it interesting as not only a regimental history, but also a story of Wilmington after the Civil War, going into Reconstruction. And Angie Zombeck has talked a little bit about this when she was on the pod, but Wilmington in the Reconstruction era, there was a predominantly African-American community that over time was able to assert themselves in local politics, being the sheriff, members of the Board of Aldermen, a growing middle class. And when the coup of 1898 happens, when you have a band of white supremacists, essentially former Klansmen, now red shirts, kind of swoop into town and burn the local black printing press, and then on top of that wage this political senseless violence against the African American community. A lot of those guys who had conspired in the coup were family members or direct veterans of the 3rd North Carolina. The Parsley family that I had mentioned, for instance, William Parsley, like I said, had been killed at Sailor's Creek. His widow, Liza, was the founder of the North Carolina United Daughters of the Confederacy and had pushed for statues and Confederate heritage in the 1890s in Wilmington. William's brother, Walter, was one of the head conspiracists of 1898, and up until, I want to say, about 3 or 4 years ago, had an elementary school named after him. And so the elite family in Wilmington kind of ran deep, not only through the conflict of the Civil War, but into Reconstruction and into the beginning of the Jim Crow South. And that's one of those things. I can't remember the author's name, but the book that had just come out, The Sixth Wisconsin and the Long Civil War. That's kind of the idea to where I look at it. They are wealthy, elite businessmen in the 1840s and 50s, staunch secessionists when the war breaks out, and the ones that survive the war eventually go on to be some of the first members of these Confederate veterans groups, and then the widows and the descendants will, push for monuments into Pender and New Hanover County in the growing decades. And on top of that, with ceremonies also comes the political violence with, the coup.
And this kind of time back to your interest in memory. And so, here this family goes through the war, and any family that has that many casualties, takes a toll on them, but they've got the influence afterwards to then shape how that gets remembered, and how, the war gets remembered, how their service gets remembered, and puts a huge stamp that maybe today a lot of people don't even realize was put on by a particular family.
Yeah, and one of the best things that I like to do about this particular one is, when you think of Wilmington in the Civil War, it always goes to, Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, maybe a couple of names about the USCTs that are fighting at Forts Road, or maybe they might talk about Wilmington during the war as a city. I think one of the things that is usually left out is those Wilmingtonians who sign up for the Confederacy and go off to fight, because that's a part of the city of Wilmington's history too. Their experience in the war, they come back with, the ones that survive at least, and that mentality that they've seen in the past 4 years, it shapes how they think of Reconstruction in the 1870s and into the 1880s.
Right. Now, you'd mentioned, how the third gets wiped out at the Mule Shoe. Let's shift gears just a little bit, because I think North Carolina saves the day for Lee's army at the Muleshoe. Even though the third gets wiped away, who stops the federal breakthrough on the east face of the Muleshoe? Why, it's James Lane's North Carolinians. Who stops them on the west face of the Muleshoe? Oh, it's Junius Daniels, North Carolinians. And then who leads the charge in on the east face or the west face of the Muleshoe? Oh, it's Stephen Ramser's North Carolinians. So, like, North Carolina plays this huge role in the fighting. We're doing this interview on the 16th of May, so the anniversary of Spotsylvania Courthouse is underway right now, and you have a particular affinity for the Overland Campaign. So what got you hooked on the Overland Campaign in the first place?
So when I was younger, my first, I guess, experience of the Overland Campaign was I went on this big spring break trip when I was in middle school, high school, and obviously, drove my parents crazy because all the time was going to be nonstop Civil War. We had
Yeah.
had a hotel in the Shenandoah, and we hit Antietam, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, Spotsylvania. We hit it Harper's Ferry. We hit it everywhere in that vicinity, and we were doing a car tour of Spotsylvania. And I remember getting out of the car. My mom and dad were going to sit in the car and just kind of wait for me, and I was going to walk around. And I got to the Muleshoe, and as I'm listening to the recording, it just starts pouring down rain, and it makes it very accurate to what the situation was, at this point, 161 years ago. Pouring down rain, nonstop mud and guck everywhere. And it really, kind of made it almost in a way come alive. And I think since then, I got really hooked on trying to understand more about the Overland Campaign. And as I did my thesis in grad school, I continued to learn more and more about its importance, not just in the grand scheme of things, but how soldiers remembered it going forward.
Yeah, yeah. It's people think I'm nuts when I get out there and it starts raining on me, particularly in anniversary time, and I'm like, "Ooh, historically accurate weather. This is awesome." And they look at me like, "What?" It's like, you know, but it is really it really makes the experience out there much more evocative when you think about how wet and miserable these guys are while they're engaged in this terrible fighting. Um, so as you were writing your thesis, then what angle did you take? How did you kind of take your interest and put it into words?
So I kind of had this thread, if any listeners or if you have seen um, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, my understanding of history is always connecting the dots like Charlie would behind the map and just saying, like, it's all connected. And the way I did it is when Grant and Lee first hit each other in the wilderness, gone immediately almost are the days of Napoleonic warfare, sitting a few hundred yards in an open field and shooting at each other with muskets. It's immediate digging in. And once Grant, what I consider the official turning point of the war, once Grant turns and continues south, that is the moment when the war is on the Union side. Because at any point in time prior, you know, you would put money on the Confederates for continuing the war. But as soon as Grant says, I'm going to keep at him like a boxer that does not let up, the way when I teach it in class, Grant views it in terms of boxing terms. He's not dodging and weaving. He's going full Mike Tyson down your throat and is not going to let up. And what I realized is as the tactics shift, the mentality of the soldiers also shifts as well. There's Thomas Hyde is a soldier from Maine. He receives a Medal of Honor at Antietam for his heroics of leading his regiment in that moment. And in places like the wilderness in Spotsylvania, in his memoirs, written 20 years after, he details that he essentially has moments of post-traumatic stress in the heat of combat. And that kind of shows me that the war is changing for the actual soldiers on the ground around them, and it's affecting them in a negative way, almost in a way mentally. One of the best quotes that I got was a veteran of, or two really, both from the Iron Brigade. Rufus Dawes considers the fighting at the Bloody Angle to be, some of the fiercest 24 hours that he encountered in the war. And another veteran of the Iron Brigade said that Gettysburg was a skirmish compared to what he witnessed at Spotsylvania. And for those veterans who had, at that point seen it all, when we think of the Civil War and bloody battles, we think of Antietam and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, but never would you equate Spotsylvania or Cold Harbor to the same way. If the soldiers are telling you it was bad, then believe them because it was. And that really puts it into that mentality. And going forward into memory, you can see it because they don't want to go back and memorialize that place.
Right.
I think, according to the National Park Service, Gettysburg has somewhere to probably about 1,300 memorials and markers. And if you combine the memorials and markers at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Cold Harbor, it barely hits 300. And
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. They realized that the war in that part of Virginia was different for them. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't full of grandeur. It was war was hell, and it was something that I think a lot of them wanted to forget and not think about. If you're gonna recollect to your kids and to your grandkids about your war service, you're not really going to go down that like dark pit of the bad things. You're going to want to tell them some of the good things. And I feel like for a lot of people, the Overland Campaign was one of those pits.
Yeah, yeah. We in fact at Spotsy we have 10 monuments, and most of them are post-war, post-veteran, that have been put up by modern organizations because the veterans themselves were just um, so shaken by their experience out there. Yeah. Do you have any plans to dive into your overland research further, take it someplace? Anything you want to do with it?
I have thought about it. Obviously, it's one of those things where right after grad school, a lot of people say that some of your best first books are your revised theses and dissertations, and it's definitely something that I'm looking into. At the moment, there's a couple other research projects that I'm doing that I feel like will get pushed out the door first, and so the Overland Campaign thesis is on the back burner for right now, but I still use it in letter. I use soldier letters and I use their experiences to really get students across to the reality of what the conflict was.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, and you also had that whole, oh, I've got to get a job thing going on too, right?
Yeah, that too.
Among the several projects that you've got in the works, uh, you mentioned earlier to me that you've got a project where you're taking a look at statues in Statuary Hall, and this, ties into your interest in memory. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's actually because of my guest writing on emerging Civil War that historian Gene Schmel was able to contact me. He really liked what I was writing, and he wanted someone to kind of come in and co-author this revised version of a book that he had put out a few years back called The Civil War in Statuary Hall. And as we've both been, delving more and more into our research, Statuary Hall used to be, up until the Civil War, was the original chamber for the House of Representatives. And obviously, as states become new, that means that they have to move out of that chamber and create a bigger chamber so everyone can kind of fit because it's cramped. The circulation for the air is not good. There's a couple of reports of, obviously people having heat strokes in the middle of August. So you got to find somewhere to put more people away from that. And so as they're building this, a representative from Vermont, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Morrill. He essentially creates this legislation in 1864 that says we should use the old House of Representatives room to create a hall to where states can present historic figures from their state as a way to, help us embody the values of those particular states. And so eventually it gets passed. And from 1865 to about, I'd want to say 1900, the majority of states that are sending statues are from northern states. Abraham Lincoln, one of the first ones is Nathaniel Greene. And so you have a lot of these old school revolutionary types, or maybe modern, more modern to them, like Abraham Lincoln. But as the turn of the century happens in 1900, 1901, the southern states start giving their statues of people that they believe best represent that state's values and beliefs. And most of them, if not all of them, are Confederate generals, Confederate politicians. As you move closer to the mid 1900s, they become more not necessarily veterans of the war, but maybe people who were affiliated or sympathetic to the cause. You know, bringing it back to my research for 1898, the two statues at a certain point as of last year were Zebulon Vance, the wartime governor of North Carolina during the war, and the second one was Charles Aycock, a man who was a fiercely devoted white supremacist. He was kind of egging on in speeches for the coup to happen. And by 1900, he becomes the governor of the state. And his statue was at the hall in 1932 and was actually just removed this past year and replaced by the evangelist Billy Graham. And you see this notion in the speeches and the transcripts of people who had spoke at these commemoration ceremonies for the unveiling of the statue. They really kind of push away the ideas of what those men were thinking of during the war. It's really more of highlighting the memory that they want to be highlighted and not necessarily the full story. Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stevens, others of that regard are actually still in Statuary Hall to this day. A few have been removed since 2000. Usually there's a uptick in removal at Statuary Hall depending on what's going on. Obviously, the events of Charleston in 2015, Charlottesville in 2017, and the summer protests of 2020, that was an uptick. Robert E. Lee was kind of removed in the middle of the night and at Statuary Hall. And it really depends on the state, according to legislation. It depends on the state to remove and approve the statues. It's not really up to the federal government. And so each state has the responsibility to what we're saying in the book. It's their shared values, their beliefs, and it's a constantly evolving situation. And the best example recently is Wade Hampton, who was a Confederate officer in the Civil War. He is being considered to be removed in replacement of Robert Smalls, whose story of escaping Charleston is something that a lot of readers and listeners are very aware of. Alexander Stevens, who still sits to represent Georgia, has been officially in the works of being replaced after the passing of Jimmy Carter. The state legislation is thinking about having Jimmy Carter take his place. And so it's a constant movement of Civil War memory. You know, Statuary Hall is essentially a mirror image or a case study of what so many other historians have discussed when it comes to the rising and falling of the lost cause over the past century, and how their movements and their, you know, influence, not only on a state level, but on a federal level, has kind of influenced how we remember the Civil War, why it's so contested nowadays, and the constant movements of it moving forward.
Yeah, wow. Wade Hampton getting replaced by Robert Smalls. Talk about bottom rail on top there.
That's definitely gonna be interesting to see how it plays out in the state legislation.
Yeah. You'd mentioned the legislation was created by a Vermont politician, Justin Morrill, and he's the
Justin
one who
Moore.
actually did the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created land grant universities too. So a guy who's got a pretty oversized impact, even though most people don't kind of remember his name offhand. So how long do you think it'll take you to get your arms around the Statues Project?
Oh man. I mean, from what everyone else has showed me as historians and colleagues, you know, book projects take a long time. You know, it's a matter of going through the actual process of researching and then putting it on paper. And then obviously there's the publishing process for revisions and edits and things like that. I think the silver lining for me, at least, is there's already some form of hardcover existing. And it's really a matter of adding on to that, getting the point across where we want it to. For us, at least, I believe the structure is kind of already there. And really, when it comes down to it, it's going to be a matter of finding the time to put it on paper and making sure it sounds concise.
And of course, once you do get it on paper, someone will vote to change the statue because that's the way that always works, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things where we constantly have to say in our proposal and our preface, you know, as of 2025, this is what's happened. And one of the funny reasons that Gene has, you know, kind of sold me on the idea is he said he's had to revise it I think at least 4 times. He's constantly had to go back because it was originally published in 2019, 2020. And obviously, since then, a lot has changed. And so,
Right.
constantly going back, updating which statues are actually there and which ones have been replaced. It's constantly evolving. And I think that's, the story of how Americans remember the Civil War. We have generationally changed our concept of what it means, what it was about, why soldiers fought, why the South seceded. It's, obviously still contested because, there are voices who would, prefer to think of it how it used to be explained.
Yeah. So with summer vacation coming up now, any big plans for recharging the batteries and plugging into the Civil War in some cool new way?
Yeah, so I'll be doing a little bit of travel pretty soon. In June will be Civil War Institute at Gettysburg. I've already got my ticket for that, so I'll be meeting up with some of our fellow contributors and kind of shooting the breeze, getting recharged for that. August will come around pretty soon after that for our own symposium, and I'm working through summer classes just to make sure that I can find time to
Uh,
get there.
yeah, very good. Well, Sam, I'm delighted to have you join us at Emerging Civil War. You've done, as I said earlier, some really neat stuff and lots of irons in the fire, as we've talked about today. A lot of great promise, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the years.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm Chris Mikowski for Sam Flowers on the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.